Do make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. They say weddings are supposed to be the happiest day of a woman's life, but mine began with humiliation. My father, of all people, made sure of that. He stood there in his perfectly pressed suit, his lips curling into that cruel smile I'd known since childhood, and mocked me, mocked the man I loved, mocked the life I'd chosen. "You really think this is a wedding?" he sneered loud enough for the guests to hear. "What kind of daughter of mine marries in a dusty uniform, with boots instead of heels, with a groom who smells more of gunpowder than perfume? You should be ashamed." His words echoed in my chest, slicing through my composure. For a moment, I thought he'd ruined me, that my vows would be drowned beneath his laughter. But then, the heavy sound of boots striking in unison shook the ground. One by one, 150 soldiers filled the courtyard, their presence casting long shadows across the aisle. And then, like a thunderclap, every single one of them raised their hands in a salute. The crowd gasped. My father's smile faltered. And I stood taller than I ever had before. But let me take you back. Because before that day of reckoning, before the salute that silenced his mockery, my story began long before the white dress, or rather, the military dress blues, ever touched my skin. My name is Mary, and if there's one thing you should know about me, it's this: I was never the daughter my father wanted. He wanted polished, obedient, soft. A daughter who'd marry a lawyer, or a surgeon, or maybe some CEO who could flash money at family gatherings. But instead, I chose grit. I chose duty. I chose a life in the military. And for my father, that choice was nothing short of betrayal. I still remember the day I told him I'd enlisted. His glass of bourbon slipped in his hand, spilling amber liquid across his desk. He looked at me as though I had confessed to a crime. "You, a soldier," he scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous, Mary. That's a man's job. You won't last a month." But I lasted. I endured the drills, the bruises, the sleepless nights, the endless commands barked into my ears. And in the chaos of deployment, I found something my father never gave me: respect, loyalty, and a family bound by sacrifice. And I found love. Not the storybook kind. Not roses and candlelit dinners. No, my love was forged in resilience, in the silence of a battlefield where we stood side by side, covering each other's backs. But my father, he never saw any of that. He never wanted to. To him, my uniform was a stain, and my love, a disgrace. And so, when my wedding day arrived, I should have expected his mockery. But what he never expected was what happened next. I should have known my father would never approve. Growing up, I was his constant disappointment, a walking contradiction to everything he dreamed his daughter would be. My older sister, Mariah, was the golden child, the one with perfect hair, pearls around her neck, and a law degree framed on his office wall. She was delicate, refined, exactly the kind of woman he wanted representing his name. Me, I was the rebellious one. The girl who climbed trees in dresses, scuffed her knees, and came home bruised from sparring with the boys in the neighborhood. I was the one who dared to say no when he handed me his blueprint for my life. But the day I told him I'd enlisted, that was the day his disappointment turned into mockery that never stopped. "You'll regret this, Mary," he spat, swirling his bourbon as though it held the answers to everything. "You're not built for discipline. You'll break the first time they yell at you." Funny how he never realized, I'd been yelled at my whole life. Boot camp didn't break me. The screaming sergeants, the grueling marches, the endless hours under a scorching sun, they hardened me. Every insult my father had hurled became fuel. Every drop of sweat was proof I was not fragile, not weak, not disposable. But the letters he sent, oh, they cut deeper than the blisters on my hands. He never wrote encouragement. Never asked if I was safe. Instead, He sent words like daggers. You're wasting your youth in a man's world. No one will want to marry a soldier girl. He was wrong. I met Daniel 2 years into service. He wasn't smooth or flashy. He didn't whisper sweet nothings into my ear. No, Daniel was steady, dependable. He carried scars I understood, and when we spoke, there was no pretending. We knew each other in raw truth, in the silences where our eyes said everything our lips couldn't. By the time he asked me to marry him, I didn't need a diamond ring to know his love was unshakable. And when I said yes, my father's fury was almost predictable. A wedding? In uniforms? He practically choked on the words. Do you know how ridiculous you'll look? Do you even hear yourself, Mary? You're turning your life into a circus. I stayed quiet. Because I knew something he didn't. This wedding wasn't just about me. It wasn't even just about Daniel. It was about every soldier who stood beside us, who understood sacrifice, who knew loyalty far deeper than money or status. But my father didn't see that. He saw disgrace. And I knew, deep in my bones, that on the day I walked down the aisle, he would try to break me one last time. What I didn't know, what he could never have imagined, was that 150 soldiers had already made a promise. And when that moment came, they would make sure my father's mockery never left his lips again. The morning of my wedding, the air was heavy with that electric stillness before a storm. I woke up in my quarters at the base, the faint scent of starch and metal lingering in the air. No perfume, no silk sheets, just the steady hum of discipline all around me. My dress uniform hung crisply on the closet door, dark blue with gold trim, medals polished to a perfect shine. It wasn't lace or satin, but it was mine. And it told my story louder than any white gown ever could. As I buttoned the jacket and laced up my boots, I thought of my father's words. A wedding in uniform? What kind of daughter does that? The memory twisted in my stomach, but I forced myself to breathe. Today wasn't about him. Or so I thought. By the time I arrived at the chapel, he was already there. Standing tall, surrounded by his business associates and smug relatives who whispered behind manicured hands. I caught the tail end of his laugh, sharp and mocking, before he turned his gaze on me. Well, he said loud enough for the crowd to hush. I see the rumors were true. My daughter really is walking down the aisle looking like a soldier boy. Snickers rippled through the guests. My aunt avoided my eyes. My cousin smirked. And my father, oh, he basked in it, like a man savoring his own performance. I held my head high, but inside, my chest tightened. My hands itched to salute just to spite him, but I steadied myself. Daniel was at the altar, waiting, his eyes steady and warm, grounding me in a way my father never could. The ceremony began, words of love and loyalty spoken in the air heavy with judgment. I could feel my father's stare, could hear the scoffs he didn't bother to hide. And then, just as the officiant asked if anyone objected, my father cleared his throat. The silence was deafening. He didn't have to speak, his smirk said enough. He wanted to humiliate me, to paint my wedding as a sham before it could even begin. My fists clenched at my sides, my jaw tight. But then, it happened. The sound. That unmistakable rhythm of boots striking ground in perfect unison. Thud. 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 Gasps swept the crowd as heads turned. Through the chapel doors, in full ceremonial formation, they came, soldiers in uniform, medals gleaming under the morning sun. Row after row until the entire courtyard was filled. 150 strong. And in one fluid, thunderous motion, every single one of them raised their right hand in salute. The air vibrated with power. The whispers died. Even the birds outside fell silent. I looked at my father then. His smirk had vanished, his face pale, his jaw slack. For the first time in my life, I saw him speechless. And me. I stood taller than I'd ever stood before. Because in that moment, I wasn't just a daughter. I wasn't just a bride. I was a soldier. And I had a family far greater than the one that tried to shame me. The chapel was frozen in time. 150 soldiers stood outside in rigid formation, their hands raised in perfect salute, their boots clicking in unison as the final echo settled into the air. The sound alone had silenced every whisper, every stifled laugh. And my father. His face was a study I'll never forget. Eyes wide, lips twitching, color draining from his cheeks. For the first time in my life, he looked small. The man who had always towered over me with judgment, who spat his mockery like venom at family dinners, who once told me I was unworthy of his name, was now speechless, caught in the shadow of something he couldn't control. I saw him glance nervously at his business partners, at my relatives, at the guests who had once shared his laughter. But none of them were laughing now. They were staring at me, at Daniel, at the wall of loyalty and honor that had risen like a fortress around us. And then, like the breaking of glass, the officiant's voice rang out again. "Shall we continue?" I turned my gaze back to my father, daring him to open his mouth again. But he didn't. He couldn't. I said my vows with a fire in my voice, every word louder than his mockery. Daniel's voice didn't waver either. It was steady, strong, filled with love that had been tested in ways my father would never comprehend. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the soldiers outside snapped to attention again. The sound of rifles lifting in ceremonial honor made the air vibrate with finality. My father flinched. And then, something happened I never expected. He stood. Slowly. His hands trembled at his sides as though he wanted to clap but couldn't bring himself to. His eyes locked on mine, not with pride, not with anger, but with something else. Something I couldn't quite name. Was it shame? Regret? Or fear that the power he'd held over me all my life had finally shattered? For once, he was the one on the outside looking in. I walked down the aisle, my husband at my side, the soldiers still saluting as we passed. And in that moment, I realized something life-changing. I didn't need my father's approval. I never had. Because the respect I'd spent years craving from him, I had earned 1,000 times over from those who truly understood what it meant to sacrifice. And as I stepped into the sunlight, hand in hand with Daniel, the thunderous sound of soldiers lowering their salute echoed like a closing chapter. But deep down, I knew my father's silence wasn't the end of this story. No, this was only the beginning. Because men like him don't stay silent for long. And when he finally spoke again, it would change everything. For hours after the ceremony, my father kept his distance. The reception hall buzzed with music and laughter, soldiers sharing stories with my friends, Daniel's comrades raising toasts that carried more weight than any champagne ever could. My new family, the one I'd chosen, filled the room with warmth. But across the hall, my father sat rigid at a table in the corner, a glass of whiskey clutched tight in his hand. His jaw worked as if he were chewing words he couldn't quite swallow. People gave him space, whispering when they thought I wasn't looking. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself his silence was victory enough. But deep down, I knew better. My father was never one to retreat. He was building to something. And I was right. When the music dipped and Daniel stepped away to greet a fellow officer, I felt a hand clamp down on my wrist. My father's grip, tight, almost desperate. "Walk with me," he muttered through clenched teeth. I wanted to refuse, but his eyes, dark, glassy, storming with something I had never seen before, pulled me outside into the quiet night. The air was cool, the sound of crickets filling the silence between us. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared out at the rows of parked cars, his back hunched, his shoulders trembling. Finally, he spoke. "You think you humiliated me today, Mary?" His voice was low, ragged. Parading those soldiers like trophies. Making me look like a fool in front of everyone. I squared my shoulders. I didn't parade anyone. They came because they respect what I stand for. Something you never could. He whipped his head toward me then, eyes burning with a strange mix of anger and pain. You don't know a damn thing about what I stand for. The venom in his tone almost made me flinch. Almost. Then enlighten me, I shot back. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You think I hate the military because I don't respect you? Because I think you're weak? He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a rasp. No, Mary. I hate it because it took everything from me. His words punched the air from my lungs. What are you talking about? He took a deep breath, his hand trembling as he rubbed his temple. Before you were born, before Mariah, before any of this business empire, I enlisted. Did you know that? I stared at him, stunned. My father? In uniform? It didn't fit. They shipped me out fast. Young, stupid, eager to prove myself. And then, one mission. One mistake. And my entire unit. His voice cracked. For a moment, I saw him not as the untouchable tyrant of my childhood, but as a man haunted. They died, Mary. Because of me. I froze. And I've been running from that shame ever since. Silence stretched between us. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. That's why you mocked me, I whispered. That's why you tried to break me. Because every time you saw me in uniform, you saw what you lost. His eyes glistened, but his jaw hardened. You should have chosen another path. A safe one. Not the same one that destroyed me. For a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. But then I remembered the years of his mockery, the poison he poured into my life, the way he tried to ruin the one day meant to honor love and sacrifice. And I realized something else. His past wasn't an excuse. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice steady. No, Dad. What destroyed you wasn't the military. It was your cowardice. And I refuse to inherit that. His face went pale. He stumbled back as though I had struck him. And in that moment, I knew our war had only just begun. When I left my father standing outside, he looked like a ghost in the moonlight, his shoulders hunched, his eyes hollow, the mask of control slipping for the first time in my life. I thought he'd retreat, maybe drown himself in whiskey until the night blurred away. But my father never knew how to suffer in silence. His pride wouldn't allow it. By the time I stepped back into the reception hall, he had already returned. His glass was full again, his posture stiff, but something about him had changed. His mockery was gone. In its place was something brittle, jagged, on the verge of breaking. And then the whispers began. At first, I thought I was imagining them. But no, their eyes kept flicking from me to him, hushed voices carrying across the room. My cousin whispered into her husband's ear. One of his business partners leaned back, eyes narrowing, as if connecting dots that didn't make sense before. Daniel noticed too. He came to my side, his hand brushing mine in quiet reassurance. "What's going on?" he murmured. I followed the whispers to their source, my father's table. My aunt was leaning forward, her face pale, her hand gripping his arm as he tried to wave her off. And then I caught a sliver of his words. Wasn't my fault, the mission, they didn't understand. My stomach sank. He was unraveling. I stepped closer, just in time to hear my uncle's low, sharp voice. "Is it true, Richard? Were you in the military? Did you abandon your unit?" The table went silent. A silence louder than any music could cover. My father froze, his hand tightening around his glass. For a split second, I saw him consider lying, saw the flicker of calculation in his eyes. But the liquor had loosened his tongue, and his shame was clawing its way out. His voice cracked when he answered. I froze. They died because of me. The words dropped like stones into water, rippling through the room. Gasps. Murmurs. Heads turning. Suddenly, all the guests were watching him, not me, not Daniel, but him. The man who once mocked my choices, who stood so high on his pedestal of pride, was now stripped bare before them all. I could see the judgment in their eyes. Not for me. For him. My father's face twisted, rage and humiliation battling inside him. He slammed the glass onto the table, the sound shattering through the hall. You don't know what it was like, he roared. You sit there in your suits and dresses, but you don't know what it means to carry the weight of men's lives. For a moment, silence hung heavy. And then, a voice cut through. It wasn't mine. It wasn't Daniel's. It was one of the soldiers. A tall sergeant who had served with me overseas. He stepped forward, his voice steady, sharp as a blade. We do know, he said. Every single one of us standing outside knows that weight. The difference is, we carried it. We didn't run from it. The words hit harder than a gunshot. My father staggered back, his face ashen, his pride crumbling before the very people he lived to impress. And for the first time in my life, I saw him not as my father, not as the powerful man everyone feared, but as something smaller. A coward exposed. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. A man like him, cornered, humiliated, stripped of his secrets, wouldn't accept defeat. No. He'd strike back. And I had no idea how far he'd go. The air in the reception hall was suffocating. One moment, laughter and music had filled the room. The next, my father's shame had spilled into the open, staining every polished surface, every chandelier's glow. His confession hung in the air like smoke, inescapable, choking. And then his rage erupted. He shoved his chair back so hard it toppled to the floor with a crash. Guests gasped, recoiling as he staggered to his feet, his face red, his eyes wild. You think you're better than me, he bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at the soldiers who had begun to close ranks near the doorway. All of you, standing there with your shiny medals and salutes, pretending you're heroes. The sergeant who had spoken earlier didn't flinch. He stood tall, his arms crossed, his silence heavier than any words could be. My father's gaze snapped to me then, and the fury in his eyes made my breath catch. And you, he hissed, his voice low, dangerous. You paraded me like a fool. You let them humiliate me in front of everyone I know. I swallowed hard, refusing to look away. You humiliated yourself, Dad. You did that the moment you mocked me for standing for something you couldn't. His jaw clenched. And then, he snapped. Before I realized what he was doing, he grabbed the microphone from the band's stand and slammed it against the table, the screech of feedback filling the room. His voice boomed through the speakers, raw and venomous. Listen to me, he roared at the crowd. This wedding is a sham. My daughter, his words caught in his throat, twisted with bitterness, is a soldier, yes, but don't be fooled. Soldiers break. They die. They leave behind ruins. That's what she chose. That's who she really is. Gasps rippled through the hall. Daniel started forward, but I held out my hand. Not yet. Not like this. Because then, my father made his fatal mistake. His eyes gleamed with spite as he leaned into the microphone. She'll end up like my unit did. Dead. Forgotten. Another name carved into stone. The silence that followed was absolute. Every soldier in that hall stiffened. Daniel's fists curled at his sides. My own chest rose and fell as fury burned through me. And then, I stood. Slowly. My boots struck the wooden floor with a weight that silenced even the whispers. I walked toward him, every step deliberate, every breath controlled. He thought he could break me in front of everyone. But he had just handed me the weapon I needed most, the truth. I took the microphone from his trembling hand. My voice was steady, cold, cutting through the air like steel. "You want to talk about the dead?" I said, staring into his eyes. "Then let's talk about them with honor. Not as your excuse. Not as your shame. But as the reason I will never be what you became." The soldiers behind me rose as one, their boots stomping once in unison, the sound like thunder. My father flinched. And for the first time in my life, he had nowhere left to run. But I also knew this wasn't his endgame. Not yet. A man like my father, wounded, exposed, was dangerous. He wouldn't fade quietly into the night. No, his next move could destroy more than my wedding. It could destroy everything. The reception ended in fragments. Guests whispered as they gathered their coats, eyes darting between me and my father like they were watching the aftermath of a battlefield. The music had long died, replaced by a tense silence that clung to the walls. My father didn't stay to see the end. After my words and the soldier's thunderous stomp, he stood frozen for a long, terrible moment, his face pale, his hands trembling. And then, without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed out, the doors slamming behind him. For a heartbeat, I thought it was over. I was wrong. Because if there's one thing I'd learned about my father, it's this: humiliation never sat quietly with him. He would rather set fire to everything than live in the ashes of defeat. Daniel squeezed my hand that night, his voice low in my ear. "Don't let him in your head. We have each other. That's what matters now." And I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But as I lay awake later, staring at the ceiling, my instincts screamed otherwise. My father's silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. 2 weeks later, I was proven right. The first sign came in the form of a phone call. My commanding officer summoned me into his office, his face unreadable. He slid a file across the desk, his fingers tapping the edge. "Do you know what this is, Sergeant Mary?" I opened it, and my blood ran cold. Inside were photocopies of documents, disciplinary reports, transfer requests, medical notes. Except they weren't mine. Not really. They were distorted, falsified, pieced together to paint me as unstable, reckless, unfit for service. My father's voice echoed in my head. Soldiers break. They die. They leave behind ruins. I clenched my fists. These aren't real. My company's eyes softened slightly, but his voice was firm. I believe you. But someone has gone to great lengths to make them look real. And they've already been submitted for review. My stomach twisted. Who would? But I didn't need to finish the question. I knew. That night, I found a letter slipped under my apartment door. No return address. No signature. Just one line, written in my father's sharp handwriting. "You can play soldier, Mary. But I will always know the truth." I crumpled the paper in my fist, rage surging through me. He wasn't just trying to ruin my wedding anymore. He was aiming for everything: my career, my marriage, my very identity. And the worst part? He had the money, the influence, and the spite to make it happen. But what he didn't realize was this: I had faced worse enemies. Enemies who didn't just want to ruin me, they wanted me dead. If my father wanted a war, then so be it. This time, I wasn't just fighting for my honor. I was fighting for my future. And I was ready to do whatever it took. The first cracks didn't show in the barracks or at the base. They showed in my home. It started with Daniel. He came home one night, jaw tight, a manila envelope clutched in his hand. He didn't say a word at first, just dropped it on the kitchen table with a heavy thud. My chest tightened before I even opened it. Inside were photos. Dozens of them. Photos of me, At the base, at the grocery store, walking home after evening drills. Grainy, long-distance shots taken by someone who wanted me to know I was being watched. And tucked between them, one photo of Daniel with a female officer. A harmless conversation in the mess hall, but captured at just the right angle to look like something else. My stomach dropped. Daniel, this isn't. I know it's not what it looks like, he cut in quickly, but his voice wavered. But whoever's doing this, they're trying to make it look like it is. We stared at each other in the dim light, both of us knowing exactly who they was. My father wasn't just attacking me anymore. He was aiming straight for the foundation of everything I loved. And he wasn't done. The next morning, Daniel got called in by his superior. Someone had anonymously reported that he was fraternizing with a married officer. The rumor was baseless, but in the military, even the whisper of scandal could stall a career. That night, Daniel's calm broke. He slammed his fist onto the counter, his voice shaking with fury. "This is your father, Mary. He's not going to stop. He's going to keep coming until there's nothing left of us." I wanted to tell him I had a plan, that I could outmaneuver my father like I had outlasted boot camp. But the truth was, I had no plan. Not yet. Instead, I sat beside Daniel, took his hand in mine, and whispered, "Then we fight back. Together." But inside, I was terrified. Because my father wasn't just rich. He wasn't just powerful. He was strategic. He had already proven he could poison my career with forged documents, turn allies into skeptics, twist shadows into weapons. And now he was targeting my marriage. The war I thought had ended at my wedding had only just begun. And if I didn't strike first, I knew my father would destroy not just my future, but Daniel's too. The night after Daniel's career was dragged into the mud, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of his steady but restless breathing beside me. My father's voice haunted me. "You can play soldier, Mary. But I will always know the truth." No. That was the last lie he'd ever tell. By morning, I'd made up my mind. We weren't going to wait for his next strike. We were going to take the fight to him. Daniel agreed without hesitation. "But we'll need proof," he said grimly. "He's powerful, Mary. No one's going to take our word over his. We need someone who knows his game." That was the problem. My father had built his empire on control and intimidation. His associates feared him, his relatives admired him, and his enemies, well, most had already been destroyed. Or so I thought. The breakthrough came 2 days later. A message slipped into my locker at the base. No name, no rank, just a folded piece of paper with 6 words written in sharp, deliberate ink. "I know what your father did." My pulse spiked. I glanced around, but the hallway was empty. That evening, I followed the instructions scribbled on the back of the note. An address in the old industrial district, abandoned warehouses lining the street. Daniel insisted on coming, his hand never straying far from the small knife he carried off duty. The building was dim, dust swirling in shafts of moonlight. And then, footsteps. A man emerged from the shadows. His face was lined, weathered, his posture stiff but strong. He wore no uniform, but everything about him screamed military. "You don't know me," he said, his voice low, steady. "But I knew your father. Long before he became who he is now." I narrowed my eyes. "And who are you?" He hesitated before answering. "Sergeant First Class James Harlow. I was there. The mission he never talks about. The one he says destroyed him." My breath caught. "The unit, the one that died." Harlow's gaze darkened. "They didn't all die, Mary. 3 of us survived. And I've spent the last 20 years watching your father rewrite the story. Blaming the dead. Pretending he was just another casualty of war. But the truth." He leaned closer, his eyes sharp as steel. He abandoned us. He left us in the field to die so he could save himself. Daniel swore under his breath, fists tightening at his sides. Harlow straightened, his voice hardening. I've been waiting for the right moment to bring him down. And now, with you, with your husband, with what he's doing to destroy you, this is it. Together, we can expose him. My heart thundered. For years, my father's power had seemed untouchable, his lies airtight. But here, standing before me, was living proof that the truth could bleed him dry. I met Harlow's gaze and nodded. Then let's end this. Once and for all. But as his words sank in, a darker realization crept over me. If my father had covered up his cowardice for decades, what else was he hiding? And how far would he go to make sure the truth never came out? Sergeant Harlow wasn't exaggerating. For the next week, he fed us pieces of a story that made my father's carefully constructed life collapse in my mind. Battle reports that had gone missing. Witness accounts buried under red tape. Names of soldiers who never made it home, men whose families had been silenced with hush money and intimidation. And then, the files. Harlow had kept copies. Faded papers, stamped with official seals, marked with casualty lists where my father's name had once been scribbled among the missing. It wasn't just cowardice, it was fraud. He had built his entire empire on the lie of a dead soldier. Daniel's jaw clenched as he flipped through the documents. If this goes public, he's finished. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to imagine my father's empire crumbling under the weight of his own lies. But a gnawing unease settled in my chest. He hadn't survived this long without anticipating threats. And now, we were the threat. That night, my unease was justified. When I got home from the base, our apartment door was ajar. Daniel's hand instinctively went to his holster as we crept inside. The lights were off. The air was cold. And then I saw it. On the dining table, where we'd left Harlow's files neatly stacked, there was nothing but ashes. Burned scraps smoldering in a metal tray. My blood ran cold. Pinned to the wall above the ashes was another note, written in my father's hand. I warned you, Mary. Soldiers die. Families die too. My chest tightened. He knows, I whispered. He knows about Harlow. Daniel's hand gripped mine. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the fear he never admitted. This isn't just sabotage anymore. This is a declaration. And then, the phone rang. I snatched it up, my voice shaking. Hello. A pause. Then a low, familiar voice. You've made a mistake, Mary. My father. Calm. Too calm. You think you can expose me. But every step you take, I'm too ahead. Ask yourself, how well do you really know your new friend, Sergeant Harlow? The line went dead. My heart pounded. Doubt clawed at me. Was Harlow truly the ally he claimed? Or was my father playing a deeper game, setting a trap that I had already stepped into? I turned to Daniel, my voice barely above a whisper. We're in the middle of his battlefield now. And for the first time, I wasn't sure who the real enemy was. The ashes on our dining table still smoked when Harlow arrived. Daniel stood between us, his stance protective, his hand hovering near the knife at his side. I couldn't move, my eyes fixed on the older soldier as he stepped into the apartment, his boots crunching over bits of charred paper. I told you to guard the files, Harlow muttered, his jaw tight. Now they're gone. But something in his tone, too sharp, too accusing, sent a ripple of doubt crawling down my spine. You weren't here when it happened, Daniel shot back. Where were you, Harlow? Who even knew about those files besides us? Harlow's gaze flicked to me. Are you really going to let him turn you against me? But I couldn't answer. My father's voice echoed in my head. Ask yourself, How well do you really know your new friend, Sergeant Harlow? The silence thickened until I could hardly breathe. My instincts screamed two truths at once. One that Harlow was genuine, a scarred veteran seeking justice, and another that he might be just another pawn in my father's endless game. Then Harlow's shoulders sagged. He reached into his coat, and Daniel instantly tensed, ready to strike. But instead of a weapon, Harlow pulled out a small, battered flash drive. "Your father destroyed the papers," he said, his voice low, rough. "But I'm not stupid. I kept digital copies, hidden, encrypted. Everything we need to expose him is right here." My pulse spiked. Was it salvation? Or bait? Daniel's hand tightened around mine. He leaned in, whispering just loud enough for me to hear, "If that drive is real, we have leverage. If it's not, it's a trap. Either way, your father knows exactly where we are." As if on cue, headlights slashed through the window. Engines growled outside. We rushed to the curtains. Black SUVs idled at the curb, their doors opening in slow, deliberate unison. Figures in dark suits stepped out, their movements too precise to be ordinary. My blood went cold. My father hadn't just anticipated us, he'd surrounded us. Harlow's voice broke the silence. "We don't have time for doubt, Mary. Either trust me now, or we all fall together." Daniel looked at me, his jaw tight. "This is your call." And in that split second, with danger closing in from all sides, I realized the brutal truth. The battlefield wasn't overseas anymore. It was here, in my marriage, my family, my very home. And to survive, I'd have to decide whether Harlow was my ally, or my father's trap. The SUVs surrounded the apartment like predators circling prey. My heart thumped so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. Daniel gripped my hand, his knuckles white, eyes scanning every shadow. "Go," Harlow hissed, thrusting the flash drive into my hand. "I can't hold them off forever." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed danger. Could I trust him? My father had planned this for months, maybe years. Every step I'd taken, every ally I'd found, it was possible it had all been a trap. Then I heard it, a single, sharp whistle outside. One of my father's men. Too close. Too fast. I made my choice. "Daniel," I whispered, voice steady despite the panic clawing at my throat. "We move now. Trust him, or at least, trust me." He didn't hesitate. We bolted toward the fire escape in perfect unison, Harlow covering our backs. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, shattering glass, spraying sparks. The smell of gunpowder filled my nose, my boots pounding the metal steps. When we hit the street, a helicopter's spotlight cut through the night, illuminating the chaos. My father's men were everywhere, but Harlow had a plan. With military precision, he led us through back alleys, over fences, and finally into a waiting armored vehicle. I clutched the flash drive like my life depended on it, because it did. Hours later, safe in a secure location, Harlow finally spoke. This drive. It has everything. All the proof of your father's lies, the cover-ups, the falsified reports. With this, he's finished. Legally, publicly, permanently." I stared at it, my mind racing. I'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, standing over my father, victorious. But the reality felt heavier than triumph. Revenge wouldn't erase years of humiliation, of fear, of betrayal. And yet, I had a choice. The next day, the world changed. News outlets lit up with the story, billionaire exposed for military cover-up and fraud. Names, dates, documents, every lie my father had spun came undone in public view. His allies abandoned him, board members resigned, family members whispered behind closed doors. And my father? He showed up at my door, face pale, eyes hollow, the once powerful man finally reduced to a shell of shame and regret. He stammered, his voice barely audible. I never thought you'd. I cut him off. You underestimated me. You mocked me. You tried to ruin me. And for what? So you could die with your lies. He couldn't respond. He could only stare, powerless, while I turned on my heel. Daniel squeezed my hand, and together we walked outside. There, lined up in perfect formation, stood 150 soldiers. My family now, my honor now, my respect now. They raised their right hands in salute, just like they had at my wedding. My father's gaze followed the salute. His face was a mask of defeat. And in that moment, I understood something deeper than victory. I hadn't just survived his cruelty. I hadn't just outsmarted him. I had reclaimed my life, my love, and my honor. The soldiers' voices carried in unison, proud and unwavering. For Sergeant Mary Johnson, your courage is our honor. I looked at Daniel, my heart swelling, and whispered, we did it. Together. The sun broke over the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched behind us. Shadows of the past, yes, but we weren't defined by them anymore. And my father? He would forever remember the day his daughter, once mocked, once humiliated, stood taller than he ever could, surrounded by loyalty, courage, and the undeniable power of truth. Because some battles aren't fought with guns or medals, they're fought with courage, love, and the unwavering will to never be broken. And that was the battle I won. Months later, my father disappeared from the public eye. His empire crumbled under investigations, lawsuits, and betrayal. Daniel and I settled into a quiet life, far from the chaos, with our wedding memory now transformed, not into shame, but into a story of survival, strength, and unshakable love. And every morning, when I lace up my boots and glance at my medals, I remember that day, the day 150 soldiers saluted me, the day I stood taller than anyone ever imagined. Because some victories are bigger than any battlefield.